Um, Thank you very much for coming. Let's start this webinar. This is our first PACE webinar in this series. We're going to have regular webinars in the coming weeks or months. And so we have scheduled 4 webinars on COP27. And we very likely will have to schedule more to talk about COP27 and many other topics that are related to PACE, to Professional Association for China's Environment. And today is our first webinar. And we are very lucky and we're very honored to have Professor Dan Guttman to be here. And it's just a very short introduction. Dan Guttman wrote a very influential book a long time ago. So it's Shadow Government. And you have not read it, and you should. That was a very classical reading about U.S. government contracting out. He's currently the fellow of the U.S. National Academy of Public Administration and also co-chair of his international panel. And he was executive director of Presidential Advisory Commission on Bioethics, presidentially appointed commissioner of the U.S. Occupational Health and Safety Review Commission. Directed the U.S. Senate investigations of government energy and environmental management. He was also the UNDP and EU foreign expert advisor on environmental law. Basically, he works on environmental law. He's currently a professor in Tianjin University Law School, and also adjunct professor in Fudan and LSE. So, and it's just so this introduction can go very long. I would not take too much time from Dan. And so I'll hand over the floor to Dan.
Yeah. Well, how is? I always say, you know, foreigners are told "xie xie" is the most important Chinese, but for me, it's "bu hao is." Thank you, bu gandang. We all know what difficulties the world has today, not only Zhongmei Hezuo, but of course, climate change and COVID. And so PACE is occupying a special place. When I came to China many years ago, people said you'd be a bridge, a qiao. Today, not so many bridges. So PACE is very important. And what I want to talk about are 2 related ideas. One is what we in the world can learn from studying other countries, studying the governance, studying the environmental governance, because we have common local problems. In the case of climate change, the world, as we know, the leaders are focused on mitigation, reducing carbon and greenhouse gases. But every day in many countries, we're experiencing the impact of ongoing climate change. And so the focus of this talk will be what can be learned from comparing how countries are adopting to climate change. And we all know, reading the news every day, whoops, let me see, this is my, every day, this year, there are floods, fires, heat, and drought. You all know, I think this is Wuhan, the Yangtze. I understand there were problems with salt in the water in Shanghai. According to the news, that was in part because of the drying up of the Yangtze earlier on in the west of China. This is Europe, this is Germany, the famous Rhine River. Obviously, it's hard to have a boat carrying commerce, so this affects supply chains as well as others using the river. Famous pictures, the United States. This is the reservoir that is supposed to provide the water for much of the Southwest, including Las Vegas, well below what's expected as normal. Not only drying up, but of course, floods. This is Florida. You all read about it 2 weeks ago now. This is Pakistan, all over the world, much more tragic. Countries that are not prepared and don't have the resources on coastal areas. Fires, California this year. So we see every week almost tragic impacts of adaptation. So what can the countries of the world do? And the background, I'm going to talk about the work that colleagues and I have been doing, many of you on the Zoom, to learn how to compare systems, particularly the US and China, to learn from each other. We have different systems of governance, Jili, but how can we learn? And then I'll talk about our current project, comparing Australia, China, and the US comparative adaptation. And we welcome any of you who would like to join in the project. This is an open project, and we have tremendous scholars and practitioners, junior, senior, even graduate students working. So 2022, again, we have beginnings of impact of climate change, and globally the focus is on mitigation. This is the focus of the United Nations nationally determined contributions. At the COP27 in Egypt, the developing countries especially are saying, what about adaptation? What are we going to do now with floods and fires? There is agreement that governance will be key. You need science to know the risks, but you need to know how to address them. And one of the first things that I discovered, I'm not a scientist like Professor Xu and others, or I'm not an expert on much, my friends are. And one of the first things I discovered when I began to read the IPCC reports is that while everybody agrees governance is key, there's very little comparison of countries. There's a lot of case studies of floods in Zhengzhou or Florida. There are some programs that have cities across the world cooperating, but there's a very surprising small amount of comparative country study. And so what we're doing, we began, I'll talk about it, in 2008 to compare China and the US, and now the latest project is comparing China, the US, and Australia as countries in adaptation to climate change. The lead sponsors are the US National Academy of Public Administration in the US, Fudan, London School of Economics, and colleagues at Melbourne and Monash. And we work with many, many colleagues. I hope Bu Maliang and Liu Bei, his wife, is a climate expert, but from Tianjin and Shanghai Jiao Tong and Hong Kong U and City U of Hong Kong. And so this is an open project and welcome. But first, a little bit of background on the idea of comparing. When I first came to teach in China many years ago at Nanjing, Tsinghua, and Beida, Jiaoda, I was surprised that you all in China, your English is as good as mine, and you use the same words of governance, terms like governance, policy, NGO, transparency, Xinxi Zhongkai, Gongkai, but the words mean different things in different systems. And I quickly learned that Chinese students are taught that Zhucheng Hainan Zhueju, Shengyu Haibei Zhueju. My pronunciation is terrible, but you know that when you take something from one country and transplant it, maybe the same name, but it's different. Americans didn't really know this. They thought sooner or later everything would look like it does in the West. But now we know in 2022, Budway, there are differences. And so to compare the countries or any countries, you have to learn how the basic governance concepts translate. So we began a project 15 years ago to translate. And the first work we did was, how do you make environmental policy or law in the United States and China? And the point of entry, the Chia Rudian, in the United States, if you want to do anything about climate, you try to make a law. Maybe you make it in Washington, or maybe you make it in California. Maybe you make it by the legislature, the president, Xinjiangfa, the administration, or the court. China has actually maybe the most effective climate change rule of any country in the world. the Jiwa Shengyu Zhengse, the one-child policy. Of course, not in effect now, but the effect of it was to reduce the number of people who were using everything. And that was, of course, a policy, not a law initially, and it wasn't about climate change. And since 2006, China's core climate rules have been in the plans, the 5-year plans and many other plans. So the first point of entry in comparison is comparing the way rules, policies are made in one country or another. In the United States, we have policy, but they under a law. The air policy is under the air law. China policy may be something that there is not yet a law. Then we talked about the US is law-centric. China is plans and policies. China also, crisis management is core. It would be hard to explain this to the world, but we see with COVID that China has thousands of years of managing crises, floods, fires, and COVID. So China's approach to COVID, we all know, quite different than in the US. So the big picture is, how do you compare the governance processes? Then comparing multi-level government. The United States is a federal system, states in Washington. China is unitary, but both countries have traditions of Difang Baohu, Shayo Zhengse, Shayo Duizi. That's wrong. Okay. So both countries, tensions between top and bottom. Both countries use many of the same tools of governance, penalties, subsidies, open information, but each country is expert in some kinds of tools. The US has pilot projects, but when I came to China, every city, every village has a Shidian, Mubiao, and Yundong. And so what are the tools? Who does the work of government? Environmental problems are very big, much bigger than the civil service workforce. One of the things that surprises many people, the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the United States Central Environmental Organization, has about 15,000 civil servants. China's Shanghai Jiao, maybe 500 or 600. So how do they manage? The United States government relies on private companies. China, Xiedanwei, like the universities many of you are at. So when I teach at Nanda or Beida, all the professors and the students are often doing research for officials. So this is, how do you begin to enter into a comparison? The final point is non-state actors. People think the US, we have many NGOs, but the idea of non-state actors is not only NGOs, but also businesses and associations like Shihui Tuanti and private businesses. In China, we just did a book on this. There are many Western non-state actors that have worked with China. WWF, you all know. Xiedanwei, the universities you're all at are like think tanks for the, if they're Gaoji University for Beijing, but for the local governments. And so Xiedanwei are a kind of organization, there's nothing like that in the United States. And Shihui Tuanti, business associations in China are now beginning to make environmental rules. Corporate social responsibility. The companies in China now are all, if they're a state-owned enterprise or on the stock exchange, have to have CSR. So even though people don't think about it often, China has hundreds of thousands of Minban Fei Chia, Shihui Tuanti, that are in some ways like Western non-state actors. And here is just an example from our book of all the sustainability standards. Starting 17 years ago, China, Shihui Tuanti began to make sustainability standards, not only for use in China, but when the companies go outside China, Yidai Yilu. And under the China standards law, these are standards that are often have legal status as voluntary standards. So this is just the big picture, the foundation for comparing climate adaptation. So now let's turn to the topic of adaptation, which is our topic. How do you learn from comparing China and the US? And Australia colleagues wanted to be involved, and they're terrific. Other countries are welcome. And again, the focus globally has been on mitigation, net zero or carbon neutrality, but climate change is here. Many of you have seen the United Nations just issued a report today or yesterday, depending on where you are, saying that the world is very much in trouble. We're not meeting the Paris target of 1.5 degrees. Parts of the world, especially the Arctic, are well above this. And so the tipping points of melting are, who knows when they're going to be reached. You all know this. I'm don't going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about adaptation. And so the first question, as we begin our discussion, thousands of years, I learned this when I go to school in the West, China has been a leader in managing natural disasters. You learn that the idea of government, adjunct, the Yellow Emperor, is the leaders have to manage the floods on the Yellow River, Wanghe. Don't know when there'll be floods, but know there'll be floods and have to prepare. China has floods, earthquakes, drought, thousands of years, crises. And so one question is, shui bian, what's the difference? What's new with climate change? Can we use the same tools? Another way of looking at it is, how will the long history of China and other countries in managing crisis, will it have to be transformed? With the governance tools and practices have to be transformed? And so here, as you all know, for thousands of years, China has been a leader in water engineering. Dujing Yuan in Sichuan still operates, very famous. You learn about this for thousands of years. So what's new? What's the big deal? The Yellow River, many thousands of years, sometimes very dry. In the 1980s, I understand, did not run to the ocean, to the sea. And so what's new? And so in our work, we're beginning by trying to see, what are the points of entry? This is the beginning of the fun part of the talk on adaptation. How do you begin to compare? And so after a year of discussions, we think, and I'm giving you my view, others may differ. This is not yet our final report, but these are what we're discussing. How do we compare? And so we use the idea of point of entry. When I first began to do environmental research at Tsinghua, my colleagues taught me point of entry, Chia Rudian. My Chinese is poor, I pronounce Hanyu call you, but how do you enter the discussion? How do you enter it? China has plans, the US has laws. And so a first question is, well, do countries do risk analyses and vulnerability studies and plans for adaptation? Adaptation is local. What you may have to do in Nanjing may be very different from what you have to do in Hong Kong or Zhengzhou. What you have to do in one part of Nanjing, the Xianlin campus, may be very different than what you have to do in the Gulo campus. One may be close to the water, another may not. One may have many factories, another may not. One may have lots of grass and trees, another may not. And so adaptation is fundamentally local. I mean, all climate activities are local. You're dealing with a factory or farm, but adaptation, you have to know the local characteristics. And so the first question in our report we're asking is, how do you compare do not only the governments in Beijing and Washington have plans, but do the localities? Do they have risk analyses? Do they have plans? And are they public? Because local businesses, local people, when they're planning, or should I put a factory here, they want to know, will this part of the city be under the water? When they're buying a house or an apartment, where will it be? Do localities have publicly available plans for risk and vulnerability? Risk is how much of a disaster is going to happen. Vulnerability is, well, maybe it's not a problem in your area. So there are two parts of the analysis. And a report by the Rand Corporation that just came out a couple of months ago says it's not so simple. You need lots of not only data, but much of the data looks backward. What happened 50 years ago, 100 years ago? Now we know with climate change, how do you get data that looks to the future? So the data that we've used about floods on the Yellow River for thousands of years may not be as useful looking forward. The second part is the data has to be spatially very detailed, maybe telling you what will happen on one part of the Nanjing University campus or one part of the CUHK campus. Cannot just be in Hong Kong or in Nanjing. And so the reality is, in all of our countries, that data is still being developed, and it's very expensive to do modeling. And some of the stuff that is available, maybe it costs a lot of money. For example, satellite data from Elon Musk. Maybe you have to pay for it. Or maybe a private company has the data. And so the question also is, you need local officials who know how to use it. So here are questions for our discussion. Questions: does your hometown, Nita Jiaxiang, or where you are now, university, have a climate adaptation risk and vulnerability analysis? Do you know? And what are the details? What kind of data is being used? Is it just the old data, or is it looking forward? What level of spatial distance? Is it maybe the whole city, or is it specific? Sometimes maybe just a few meters, a few feet. How about a climate adaptation plan? Does not only your city, but maybe if you're in Shanghai, it's the Huangpu district or the Pudong district, because each area may be different. Does it have a plan? And are these documents public? Because the decisions that are being made every day by companies and people. Should I build a factory here? Should I move here? You need to know. Well, for Shanghai Ren, I'm a Shanghai person, and it's interesting and amazing to me that Pudong, of course, is not only on the Huangpu River, but it's also on the sea. And Elon Musk builds his Tesla factory there. So when he builds his Tesla factory, much of the expert research says Shanghai is one of the most endangered cities for flooding. It's on the coast. So when Elon Musk builds his Tesla factory, is he prepared for what will happen 10, 20, 30 years? And as I think you all know, the new town, Nanhai, Lingang, new town, model new town, also there. A good friend of mine from Shanghai helped develop the new town. And so I discussed with her, what did you plan for about sea level rise? Sea level rise, Manzhou, right? Do you plan for what may happen so that the new lake, the beautiful new lake, may be under the water? So that's the first set of questions. Second point of entry, we only have 4, so don't worry about that. What does organization of the government for adaptation look like? So as we know, for thousands of years, China government has been organized for traditional crises, floods on the Yellow River, drought, earthquakes. But now we have these new kinds of crises with adaptation. Some of them are traditional floods, but they may happen more often and they may be much worse, like Zhengzhou in last summer. And also sea level rise, a new kind of crises because the coasts are so developed in China and the US, millions of people. 500 years ago, maybe not so many people, they could move. Now we have tens of millions of people, 25 million in Shanghai. So a first question is, what is the relation between organization for what I'll call traditional crisis and climate adaptation? And there's a wonderful study you can all look at by our colleague Qie at Tsinghua and Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, and wonderful friend and colleague Zhao Xiaofan, who's also in Hong Kong, and Zhou Dadi, who's very famous. And they did this study, and you can get it, it's on the web. And they say, on the whole, China's climate risk governance is still focused on traditional disaster prevention and mitigation. Adaptation actions are still beginning. The two efforts have not yet formed a synergy. Now, some cities are adding resilience officers, but is that enough? That's just 1 or 2 people. And the second question from our research, well, Australia, for example, has many central and local adaptation plans and risk analyses, and they're public. You can go on the web. But there was a disastrous flood in coastal Australia, and the investigation, a parliamentary investigation, found many failures. It was a disaster. The vast majority relate to institutional and governance failure. Lead agencies failed to provide leadership. They created confusion. They responded poorly. They were not prepared. They failed to communicate. They failed to get the support of the local animal doctors, veterinarians. So a second big question is, even when you have the plans, what happens when there's a disaster? Very famous American boxer, fighter, he said, everybody has a plan until you get punched in the face. Then your plan disappears, right? So a first question is, do each of our countries have integration, Yitihua, of traditional and adaptation? And a second, what happens? And so we're finding in the US, beginning of called homegrown, citizens are creating networks with governments to start from the bottom. So my questions here, thinking about your own city, Nanjing or Hong Kong, what does the government organization for climate adaptation look like? Is there a bureau in the ministry of the Huanjin that's about adaptation? Is there a place in the Renda that's looking at? Maybe there's an officer. And how do the people that are working on adaptation relate to the crisis management people? So this is a very basic practical question. You're all practicing or scholars of environment. Wherever you live, this is a simple question. Henji and Dan, if you go on the website, can you find the Adaptation Bureau? Well, maybe there won't be a bureau, but maybe there'll be some part somewhere. And how does it connect? The last 2 points of entry are the most interesting for me. The dynamic, the dongtai, scaling up. So the question here is, maybe one part of one city in the United States or China takes action. But of course, we need the whole country to take action. How does this work? And it has to be each local area. So let's compare GDP and adaptation dynamics. So I learned Gaiga Kaifang, it started local, the town and village enterprises. You didn't have to tell the local official, we want to grow to the GDP. They say, good idea. And the mubiao were simple. We create a new business, we add new jobs. This year we have no jobs, next year we have 300. So we all know this remarkable story. Of course, after the town and village, then you have the special economic zones and Shenzhen and many others. But at the beginning, it was, you could say, local development of models that became quickly all over the country. In some kinds of environmental problems like PM, RD, and Wu, you can measure, you can say, we want to reduce the amount of PM, RD, and Wu by 2.5% or 10%. And maybe you can do that pretty quickly, 3 years, 5 years. Adaptation, very different. You don't know what is going to happen. You can say maybe 30% chance, 50% chance. You don't know if it's in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. And so you have to make investments today, but you are not sure whether they will be useful. And so how do we think about what are the stories to think about how this can develop? So of course, one possible story, experimentation. China, the world leader in Shidian. Whoops, let me go back. Shidian, that we're going to have local experiments. And maybe it succeeds in one city and other cities pick it up. In environment, you all know, for 15 years, China has many environmental Shidian, eco cities, sponge cities, emissions pilots. The US has similar things. So one good news is maybe local experiments with central direction and money. Another, population, people will move. The United States, Australia, people have moved all the time. As we all know, the white people came from Europe to settle the United States and Australia. In America, people came, the white people, to the East Coast, then they moved to the West. China, in the Gaiga Kaifang, hundreds of millions of people, of course, moved, Nongmingong and otherwise, to the cities. So migration is not unusual, but this is a very, very basic question. How will this happen? Will cities say, we have to tell the people that live in this area, you have to move? Or will individuals just decide for themselves? I went to college in Rochester, New York. It's north near Canada. This part of the United States may be a place where people want to come in climate change because it won't be a disaster, it seems. So will some places say, come to our cities? Maybe cities, I don't know, maybe Nemangu will be very attractive because it won't be so hot. And people may say, come from Shanghai. So what will be the dynamics of population? So then, question, you all know as an example, sponge cities, right? As an example, starting in 2013, not started because of climate change, but maybe useful. How many of you have looked at the sponge city experiments in your area? So here's a chart by Zhao Xiaofan. Two kinds of Shidian related to climate change. One is the sponge city, and the other is adaptation. So this is the one that I think we'll focus on, adaptation. How many of you know that there are adaptation pilots in China? apparently about 28. How many of you know where they are? Are there any adaptation pilots in, I see Meliang and Nanjing, or, Professor Xu in Hong Kong? Where are they? Are any of them in the big cities? Are the documents public? Are the plans public? They began about 5 years ago. Are there public evaluations? So China is the land of local experiments. What has been happening with the adaptation related experiments? Will the tradition of local experimentation that powered GDP, will it also work for adaptation? So this is, again, is there a climate adaptation Shidian in your city? Have you read the plan? How about the evaluation? The final point of entry, to use this word, is people say we're going to have to transform the traditional ways of governance, the tools of governance. How do we begin to think about that? And so one way of thinking, these are some ways we're looking at. If you go to Gongongguan Li, it's very simple. There should be models, best practices. Maybe the central government, Beijing, coordinates them, and the experts from Beijing help the experts in Nanjing. And we do these experiments and see if they work. When we compare the countries so far, not working so well. How do you link central government, experts, localities? A big problem, like COVID, climate change doesn't stop at boundaries. Doesn't say, oh, I only stay in Shanghai, I only stay in Pudong. So you need regional coordination. How does this work? Again, for thousands of years, the Yangtze River, Huanghe, there have been coordination. How will it work with adaptation? Transforming traditional tools of government. Mubiao. Again, China is the world of Mubiao. There are hundreds, thousands, millions of Mubiao, right? But many of them make sense. We add 500 jobs. We increase the GDP by 2, 5, 6%. But how, and with pollution, you can say we reduce PM/RDN-Wu by 6%. But how do you think of the Mubiao for adaptation? Maybe something will not happen for 10, 20, 30, 40 years. How do we think about it? Financial resources. Where will the money come from? So in the West, the insurance industry, very important in driving change. So the insurance industry in the West is now beginning to focus on climate change. So if you live near the water where there's a flood, maybe it doesn't give you insurance. But the disasters may be so big and the risks so uncertain, maybe the insurance industry, impossible, may banfa. Public availability of risks and models. Xinqigong Kai, not only in a country, but across country. So we all know that because, for example, the rivers in countries flow between countries. The great rivers of Asia start in many of them in Shizan, they flow to other. Will there be not only public information in the country, but across the countries? Technology assessment. One of the words that's now becoming popular in in discussions, the IPC, is you make investments, but they're big mistake. How do we prevent that? Maladaptation. Now, especially, everybody is focused on new technologies, the geoengineering, AI. So maybe people think, well, this will solve a problem, but you invest and it's henda mafan, right? So we think about sponge cities. Maybe people think we build sponge cities, spend a lot of money, But if it's in Pudong, maybe the whole area is underwater because of sea level rise, right? How do you know? And technology assessment, how do you think in advance to make sure that what you're doing will have as little risk as possible? Finally, how to address what friends call path dependency on crisis management. Those of you that are governance scholars know path dependency is a very popular idea. You continue to do tomorrow what you've been doing yesterday. And so I had a wonderful discussion, well, all my discussions with China colleagues are wonderful, about China and these questions. And so for thousands of years, China has been managing natural crises, floods, earthquakes. It's hard to predict the climate crises. Maybe the flood, maybe Shanghai will go underwater, but it may not be for 100 years or 50 years. And maybe by then we'll have new technology. So maybe people think, shui bien, I don't need to do anything. I'll just continue the traditional approach. If there's a crisis, the government will fix it. And so we see in Florida, in the United States today, all the disasters, people's houses are destroyed. People die, but now people try to move back in. In fact, we read in the newspapers, people say, very good opportunity. It's cheaper to buy these houses, to buy the property because they've been destroyed. So I can finally afford to buy a house on the coast of Florida. So this path dependency, we continue to do what we've always done. Maybe people think the uncertainty is so big, that's the best. And the way that this actually gets expressed is very, very interesting. In the United States, you remember President Trump, of course, said, make America great again. President Obama said, yes, we can. It's possible. And President Biden says, we're going to build back better. But the experts that we talk to on China, on climate change, say maybe may Banfa, you can't build back better. Not possible. We may have to make very difficult choices. People may have to move. We know this already. Well, the small islands, of course, that are going underwater. What will happen to these people? In the Arctic, the small native groups, their homes will be underwater. And so in the West, sometimes we call this tragic choices. We learned from China that maybe crisis is opportunity. And so the governance question is, how do we organize our governance to make these choices in the way that is most likely to help everybody? And we all know part of the problem, rich and poor. The rich people often can move and the poor may not be able to. In New Orleans, there was a terrible flood. Many of the poor people still live there, but there aren't social services. That's been taken away. And so this is a big picture. And in the discussion, again, questions. How many of you know, is there a climate risk analysis and adaptation plan in wherever you are now and in your hometown? Yo Wenti, are they public? How about, does your local government have an organization location for adaptation? So I conclude my favorite picture when I first came to Shanghai. This is in Shujiahui. Not only did Chinese students read, they still do, but they actually read books. Now they mostly Weixin, right? And this was amazing to me because in America, you'd never have seen so many young people in bookstores reading books. So Tian Shi Di Li Ren He, hopefully. So I think I've talked enough. So Wenti, my questions are, do you know, I'd like to hear from everybody, do you have an adaptation plan or risk analysis in your hometown? But Professor Xu, do you want to take over?
Thank you very much, Professor Guttman. So now we have a few minutes to take in questions. Do you have any question that you want to raise from the audience?
Well, again, I have my question. Is there anybody there that has a hometown that has a climate adaptation plan or a pilot project? Does anybody have a hometown with or a university town with an adaptation pilot project?
Yeah, I think I don't know in Chinese city they have one, but in Fairfax, Virginia, yes, there is a adaptation plan.
Okay, but what about in the China cities? So here's Washoe lives in a kind of rich place near Washington, but it's not big. It's like a village in China, right? White's Washoe?
Yeah, it's a kind of 1 million people.
Oh, really?
County,
Wow.
yeah, Fairfax County have 1 million people. But it's one as per household income, it probably number 3 or number 5 among all the counties in the States.
Okay, so it's a
just like Beijing, you know, so there are so many, you know, government contractors living in this area.
So there's 1 million people. So does anybody know, Maliang, does Nanjing have an adaptation plan and risk analysis? Do the districts have one?
I'm not aware of this. Yeah, you just ask the pipeline. Yes, this I'm not aware either.
Do you think Bei knows?
Perhaps, yeah, I will ask her. Yeah.
Okay, you have an expert. Bei is a good friend of Maliang.
Well, in Hong Kong's case, basically, for example, you go to Hong Kong MTR stations, especially the underground ones. So before you get into the stations, you always have to climb a little bit up, a few stairs up, then before you can enter the station, because Hong Kong has too much rain. And so they have to think very carefully when they design this kind of facilities, make sure that no rain will get in. Especially last year when the things that tried to happen in Zhengzhou. So because we did study a little bit before that, and as we found, it's many other cities actually don't have this kind of design to think, what if they got big rain, whether the rainfall water can get into the subway tunnels. So that's so that we found out in Hong Kong's case, that has been already considered. But of course, you know, so in Hong Kong's case, adaptation has not been very systematic. So hopefully in future, the city can do better.
Well, so this is
we have a few in the chat box.
Oh, good.
I'm not sure you can see it. And basically,
oh yeah. Let me see the chat box. Okay, very good.
we can read it out.
Hi, Professor. Okay, in Africa, some countries build up an insurance. So this is a very interesting question. How much? Let's say that Shanghai Pudong is under the water. How much insurance will you need? Or farmers in Africa. I have friends working in India. Let's say that every year there is a flood and the farm. Well, another problem is this gets to actually very basic questions about the global change in agriculture, that as climate changes, what you can grow in an area will change from area to area. Also, the insects, the animals will change. And so let me ask Cao Deja, do you think that the insurance company will be able to predict whether the farmers, if they're insuring the farmers, or the companies will continue to be able to exist in this area? Or will they have to move to some other part of the country, or maybe some other country? How does an insurance company work with that?
Yeah, Deji, if you want to respond, you can just unmute yourself. Go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead, Deji.
Yeah.
By the way, Dan Deja is visiting attorney at Yale, and he's trying to work with Carl and Jay.
Oh, hope to see
Yeah.
you.
Yeah,
hope
nice to meet you, Professor. Yeah, thank you
Go
for
ahead,
a
yeah.
very interesting topic on this climate change adaptation point. So yeah, as you just said, I think you raised a very interesting question about the cost of the kind of like the premium that will be like taken by the insurance company. But in my opinion, I think maybe I'm not sure, but I'm just guessing that maybe the some of the local government, they can like spare some of their budget to kind of like coordinate with each other to like launch a capital program, like support the mitigation plans in the
Okay,
areas
so
of the similar
this is very interesting. 我是中国通, I'm a 中国通. And so I'm joking, of course. But first, two related questions. One to what Professor Xu has said, the subway example, and what Gordon says in the chat box. Certainly, that's about the thousands of years of history China has dealing with floods. But is that looking forward to whether the floods will be much, much, much worse and the sea level rise? Now, Deja, you raise a very interesting question. So we just did a webinar at Fudan with the University of Pennsylvania, and you all know that the cities get a lot of their money from Fangdichan, real estate, right?
Yeah.
And now, Xiaomafan, big question. And so now the hot topic, we did a webinar on is property taxes, right? Which also is a controversial issue, right?
Yeah,
So
sure.
a big question, where does the money come from? And let me go even deeper to the comparison. So in China, where will the cities get money from, right? The United States, it's equally interesting because the United States cities, we have property taxes. And that's what's very important to the city, if you own property. But of course, who pays the taxes? Rich people. They own, bigger, better property. So one of the problems, let's take Florida or California, maybe the richer people, they own houses that are on the coast. And we know they're going to be again and again flooded and need to be repaired. So maybe you're a policy expert and you say we should move the people from the coast, you cannot live there. But it's the rich people. And if you lose the rich people, you lose your property taxes, right?
Yeah.
So the question, the next question, thinking the way you're thinking is very good. Where does the money come from?
Yeah, I think you're right. Because you just like pivotal to the point, because I didn't think about like the funding the fundamental resources about those fundings, where it come from. Yeah, it's kind of like different from the situations in America, where the local government can raise the money from the property taxes, but in China we don't have that. So yeah, I think you're right. I just
Well, so another question, as we think about it, the builders who build, say, Shanghai or Hong Kong, maybe they say too risky, I will build in Chengdu, or Chongqing. And so what happens to the Shanghai ability to give insurance, right? I mean, these are questions for you to study, and there's no answer in any of our countries. Where does the money come from?
Yeah, I think it's a very good point. Thank you, Professor. Thank
No. And it's funny, China picks up another globe, PPP. You all know PPP, right?
Yeah.
So the sponge cities were supposed to be funded by PPP. But I think, Feng Kuang, it's crazy. Why would a business invest money for 30 years when it doesn't know if, this will be underwater, right? So how do PPPs, this example of a tool, how do they work, right, with adaptation?
Thank you.
No,
Thank you for the point. Yeah.
Thanks. Do we have other questions? So Dan, you mentioned about China's thousands of years of experience in managing crisis. But actually, if you look at the entire history, so the cost could be too high. For example, we suffered a lot of this crisis, and if you see that China did go through that. But if you see that the cost of going through that kind of crisis could be too high, especially so it was there at that time, so people accepted, but today this kind of high cost may not be acceptable. So how should we deal with this kind of things in managing our climate change, and also design a new set of rules, new set of procedures to adapt to climate change and manage this kind of crisis?
Yes, this is a deep, I think my colleagues think about this. So let me give the big picture. When I come to China, San Guo, Hujia Bifen, Fenjiao Bihe, right? So China, Woshi Yotairen, I'm Jewish, long tradition, long suffering, right? Sometimes, but now with Shihui Jui, the idea is progress, right? So in the West and in China, until recently, we believe in progress, right? Build back better, right? China is the world of double win, Shuangying, right? And so this is what I talk about as path dependency. We now like to think in the West and developed countries in China, continued progress, right? And so that's a deep question. Do we have to think, well, maybe cannot continue this way? I mean, we may have to limit, right? And then how do you decide? Maybe you let people choose. In the West, we say, vote with your feet. People say, I'm moving from Shanghai because it's too risky with climate change, right? Do you let the market decide, or does the government decide? But in either case, these are the questions, right? Where does progress take? I mean, now, there are many people who like to think in the West, we can have win-win. So green jobs, double win, made in China, solar energy, electric cars. We hope so, but according to the scientists, you're the expert, right? Can we have win-win? I mean, I ask you, right? What do you think?
Well, I would say that so we can try our best to maximize synergies, of course, but there's no free lunch, basically.
Okay, so that's the question. So it's psychology, Xinli Shui. Do we continue as if, well, maybe we'll have a solution? Technology, right? But what if we can't? So it's the psychology of governance, right? Right?
Indeed.
Yeah.
So probably has to get to the final question from
Let's see.
Gordon.
If I may, I would like to raise a question.
Yeah, Gordon.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Of course.
Hi, Dan. Very good to see you, and very interesting presentation. Since you're talking about the adaptation, I know nothing about the adaptation in terms of the governance of climate change. To me, I think from the literature, adaptation means a kind of flexibility. I think that's why you talk a lot about the policy as approach to tackle the climate change, right? And my question is, how about law? What is the role of law in terms of, getting to the adaptation to the climate change? Thanks.
So let me say, Ma Le is starting a new school at Huazheng. He's going to be a top leader of a new international, and you all should talk to him. He's not an environmental science expert, but he is law and right. So you have good combination. But his question is one Maliang and others know, my colleagues and I long thinking about. In the West, of course, you all know, we like to talk about the need for rule of law, binding legal agreements.
Mm-hmm.
funny, interesting thing with climate change, the UNFCCC, the United Nations framework, the United States Congress has not agreed and will not agree to that treaty. So in the Paris, we don't have binding legal agreements, but we have promises. And so your question is law flexible enough? Because they take a long time to write. Things change. China is kind of a world leader in Mubiao goals. So at the global level, we have the United Nations sustainable SDGs, right? So this is a very basic, a comparative question. Part of the problem is, how do you have goals for adaptation? You say we should have a plan, but that's just paper, you know. And how do you, even if you don't want to use law, how do you think about the traditional kinds of policy tools like a plan and a Mubiao? What do you say? Say, well, Shanghai should have a plan. So the leader goes to Huazhong and says, Ma Le, write a plan. Here's a plan, right? You know, so how do you have either case? But that's a basic question. Maybe the traditional law is not flexible, takes too long. These are real questions. This is where you can do cooperation with the other guys and women on the Zoom
Thanks.
here.
Looking forward to that.
Yeah.
We have a final question from Gordon. So basically the question is how to address the discrepancy and conflict for local and central government in terms of climate adaptation in different regime types, specific China and West.
You know, this is very interesting, because I know people say, well, China is top down, and anything Americans think, oh, whatever the leader says, it will happen. But of course, there's Difang Baohu and everybody. And I just read a book, A History of the Yellow River Management. And what was interesting is even during the period of Chairman Mao, the leaders recognized you needed bottom up also. For thousands of years, you know, there's the famous history, the leaders at the center think or want to control everything, but no, me banfa, it's impossible. So I think it isn't so clear that the distinction between the China system and the Western system, you know, maybe they're both more flexible. That's one part. The other part of the answer to Gordon's question, I think, has to do with the tradition. You all know the United States, we talk about rights. We have a right to a gun. We have a right to this. We have a right to that. China, in the Confucian tradition, Kongzi, you have rights and you have duties. That's the China Constitution. So the difference may not be so much in the top down, but in the culture. The one-child policy, to me, is an example. You have a right to have one child, but a duty in the old days not to have two. So I don't think it's got to do so much with top down or bottom up, but with cultural traditions that may be connected to that.
Great. So we have another one. So I'm not sure whether.
Yeah, sure. Yeah,
a very quick one from Regent.
Yeah, well, that's fine. Carbon tax. Well, I don't know. See, carbon tax is about reducing greenhouse gases. And that's mitigation, but that's manzo. It won't help prevent a flood in Zhengzhou next year. And that's the question. And insurance for individuals, it's great. But the question is, this is very basic for economists like Mao Liang, moral hazard. If you tell me no problem, I can have insurance, then I will say, great, I can live on the coast. And if there's a flood, the insurance company will pay me the money. So carbon tax is, many economists, many people say it's great, but that's for mitigation, not what's happening today. I mean, it slowly will help. And insurance, you want to go into the business, you can make lots of money if you can figure out how to do it.
Okay, great. So thank you very much, Professor Guttman. So now we have to conclude this talk, as we have already been a few minutes beyond the set deadline, the time set. And so thank you very much. Thanks.
Yeah, can I just say, anybody who would like to participate in our project, work with, more than welcome. This is really crowdsourced. You all know things that the participants in our project don't know. So you're all welcome. And I think you have my email. So thank you so much. What is it? Busha, Zhao Shanghao. Okay. I forget whether it's Wan Shanghao or Zhao Shanghao. Who knows?
Thank you very much. So I guess we should conclude. And the next webinar will be on November 9th, Wednesday at the same time. And in Washington, DC, that will be 8:30 p.m. on Tuesday, November the 8th. So thank you very much, Professor Guttman. So thanks also to the audience.
Thank you all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dan. Take care.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan.